The making of the Giggling Granny. In the annals of American crime, few figures are as chilling and paradoxical as Nannie Doss, the woman who became known to the press as the Giggling Granny and the Jolly Black Widow. Behind her sweet grandmotherly smile and constant laughter lay a trail of poisoned teacups, dead husbands, and shattered families. Between the 1920s and 1950s, Nannie murdered at least 11 people, including 4 of her own husbands, 2 children, her mother, her sister, her grandson, and her mother-in-law. Yet she confessed with a strange lightheartedness, often laughing as she described her crimes. To the world, she seemed like a kindly housewife with a passion for romance magazines, crossword puzzles, and Sunday gossip. In reality, she was one of America's most prolific female serial killers. But how did a seemingly ordinary farm girl from the American South turn into a poisoner who killed those closest to her? The story begins not in the shadow of crime, but in the harsh world of rural poverty, strict fathers, and unfulfilled dreams. A difficult childhood. Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, later renamed Anniston. She was one of 5 children in a poor farming family. Her father, James Hazel, was a strict, controlling man, while her mother, Lou Hazel, was a quiet, submissive woman. Life on the farm was hard. From a young age, Nannie was expected to work long hours in the fields, tending crops and livestock alongside her siblings. Her father refused to let her or her sisters attend school regularly, believing that farm work mattered more than education. As a result, Nannie's formal schooling ended early, and she struggled with reading and writing throughout her life. James Hazel was also deeply protective and distrusting of men. He forbade his daughters from wearing makeup, nice dresses, or going to dances, fearing they would attract unwanted attention. Nannie grew up isolated, yearning for romance, but crushed under her father's control. When she was 7 years old, Nannie's life changed forever. During a family train trip to visit relatives, the train jolted suddenly, causing her to lurch forward and hit her head on a metal seat. She was unconscious for hours and suffered from recurring headaches, depression, and blackouts afterward. Later, she would blame this accident for many of her problems, including her violent fantasies and mood swings. Early fascination with romance. Though her education was limited, Nannie found a form of escape in romance magazines and newspaper Lonely Hearts columns. She loved reading sentimental love stories about perfect marriages, kind husbands, and happy homes. These tales became her obsession, and she began to dream of escaping her father's farm through marriage. As she grew older, Nannie began to rebel against her father's rules. She wore dresses in secret, painted her lips, and fantasized about falling in love. But her lack of freedom at home left her vulnerable to the first opportunity for escape that came along. A teenage marriage. At just 16 years old, Nannie married her first husband, Charlie Braggs, a co-worker from the linen factory where she had found employment. Charlie was only 17, and his situation was complicated. He lived with his mother, who was controlling and possessive. The young couple moved into Charlie's home, but any hope Nannie had for romance was quickly shattered. Her mother-in-law dominated the household, keeping Nannie under her thumb. Charlie was weak-willed, often siding with his mother over his wife. The marriage soon turned miserable, filled with arguments, jealousy, and bitterness. Still, between 1921 and 1927, Nannie gave birth to 4 daughters. She longed for happiness, but her resentment toward Charlie grew. She accused him of being unfaithful and irresponsible, while he accused her of being controlling. Their marriage teetered on the edge of collapse. The first suspected murders. In 1927, tragedy struck the Braggs household. 2 of Nannie's daughters suddenly died from what doctors believed was food poisoning. Both had eaten a meal prepared at home before falling violently ill. Though suspicions swirled around the suddenness of the deaths, no investigation was launched. Charlie, however, became fearful. He fled with their oldest daughter, leaving Nannie behind with the youngest child. Later, he would claim he left because he was afraid Nannie would kill him too. She was not right, he told people. Shortly after Charlie left, Nannie's youngest daughter also died under mysterious circumstances. Again, the cause was attributed to natural illness. Alone and grieving, or pretending to grieve, Nannie began searching for love once more. A string of husbands. Nannie's obsession with finding true love led her to seek partners through Lonely Hearts ads. These ads, which were common in newspapers at the time, allowed people to describe themselves and search for companionship. Nannie would write heartfelt letters to men across the country, often presenting herself as a lonely widow seeking stability. Her second marriage came quickly. She wed Frank Harrelson, a factory worker, in 1929. At first, Frank seemed like the perfect gentleman, and Nannie was enchanted by his kind words. But the reality soon soured. Frank was an alcoholic and often abusive. Despite the rocky marriage, they stayed together for over 16 years. During this time, Nannie's pattern of violence began to escalate. Relatives who annoyed her, children who stood in her way, and husbands who disappointed her all seemed to suffer mysterious deaths. In 1945, Nannie's father died suddenly. Though he had been strict and domineering, his death freed her mother, Lou Hazel, from years of control. But shortly after his passing, Lou moved in with Nannie, and within months, she too was dead. Relatives whispered that Nannie poisoned her, but no one dared accuse her outright. The death of Frank Harrelson. By 1945, Nannie had grown tired of Frank's drinking and abuse. On one particularly bad night, he came home drunk and assaulted her. That was the breaking point. Smiling sweetly, Nannie decided to end their marriage the way she ended so many relationships, with poison. She slipped rat poison into his jar of corn whiskey. Frank drank, became violently ill, and died shortly afterward. His death was attributed to alcohol poisoning, and Nannie walked away a widow once again. For most women, 2 failed marriages, 3 dead children, and a dead husband would have been enough tragedy for a lifetime. But for Nannie Doss, this was only the beginning. With each death, her confidence grew. She had discovered a method of control, poison, that left no marks and raised few suspicions. Her laughter, her cheerful demeanor, and her grandmotherly appearance allowed her to hide in plain sight. And with the Lonely Hearts columns, filled with desperate men seeking companionship, Nannie had no shortage of new victims, poison in the teacup. By the end of the 1940s, Nannie Doss had already buried 2 children, a mother, and at least 1 husband. Each death was explained away as either illness or accident, and no one seemed to notice the dark pattern forming around her. With her cheerful laugh and grandmotherly manner, she remained above suspicion. But for Nannie, the killings were not only a way to rid herself of abusive husbands and inconvenient relatives, they were also part of her twisted search for the perfect romance. Her obsession with love stories and Lonely Hearts columns drove her from one man to another, and whenever her fairy tale expectations were crushed by the realities of marriage, she reached for her trusted solution. Arsenic or rat poison slipped into food or drink. The third husband, Arlie Lanning. After poisoning Frank Harrelson in 1945, Nannie wasted no time in searching for another partner. Through the Lonely Hearts ads, she met Arlie Lanning, a man from Lexington, North Carolina. He was in his 50s, a heavy drinker, and not the charming gentleman Nannie had imagined. But at first, he showered her with attention and promises of stability. They married quickly. However, just like her previous husbands, Arlie revealed flaws that disgusted Nannie. He spent too much time in bars, was often drunk, and cheated openly. But instead of leaving him, Nannie played the role of the devoted wife. To neighbors, she seemed patient and kind, often tending to Arlie when he came home intoxicated. Behind closed doors, she plotted his end. In 1950, Arlie suddenly fell ill with what doctors believed was heart failure brought on by years of drinking. In reality, Nannie had been slipping poison into his alcohol and food. He grew weaker by the day until he finally died in bed. Arlie's death did not raise suspicion. Everyone believed it was due to his lifestyle. But Nannie wasn't finished. While grieving neighbors comforted her, she used the opportunity to seize control of his property. The convenient house fire. After Arlie's funeral, Nannie moved into his home full-time. But not long after, the house mysteriously burned down. Neighbors whispered that Nannie had been careless with a cigarette or stove, but some suspected the fire was deliberate. Conveniently, Nannie collected the insurance money. Even more suspicious, after the fire, Nannie's mother-in-law, who had been living with them, suddenly died. Once again, the cause was listed as natural illness, and no one questioned the cheerful widow who always seemed surrounded by tragedy. At this point, even Nannie's own family began to suffer under her poison. Her sister Dovie, who had been ill and bedridden, came to live with her. Within weeks, Dovie was dead too. For Nannie, killing was no longer just about removing husbands. It was about control, power, and convenience. Anyone who became a burden or stood in her way could be eliminated with a smile and a spoonful of poison. The fourth husband, Richard Morton. In 1952, Nannie answered yet another Lonely Hearts ad and met Richard L. Morton of Emporia, Kansas. Richard was a former salesman, charming and friendly, but like her previous husbands, he quickly disappointed Nannie. He was unfaithful, spending time with other women, and she grew resentful. Still, she played the part of the loving wife, cooking meals, laughing at his jokes, and pretending to adore him. Privately, she prepared her familiar remedy. Soon, Richard began experiencing stomach pains and fatigue. Doctors suspected a stomach infection, but his condition worsened until he finally died in 1953. For the third time in a row, Nannie walked away a widow, this time with Richard's life insurance policy in her pocket. But her trail of death was starting to catch up with her. Relatives and neighbors whispered about how often Nannie's husband seemed to die. Still, no police investigations were launched. In the 1940s and 1950s, poison was difficult to detect without special testing, and Nannie's victims were often assumed to have died from natural causes. The fifth and final husband, Samuel Doss. Later in 1953, Nannie moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she met Samuel Doss, a clean-cut, church-going man. Unlike her other husbands, Samuel was not abusive, unfaithful, or drunk. He was a widower seeking companionship, and he treated Nannie with kindness. But for Nannie, there was a problem. Samuel was boring. He disliked romance novels and magazines, preferring educational books and sermons. He restricted what Nannie could watch and read, and he was frugal with money. To Nannie, this was intolerable. She craved excitement and passion, not routine and discipline. She soon grew restless and decided Samuel had to go. In September 1954, Samuel was hospitalized with severe stomach pains after eating a meal prepared by Nannie. He recovered and was released, but just 2 days later, he was dead. This time, however, doctors were suspicious. Samuel had been a healthy man, and his sudden illness and death raised red flags. They ordered an autopsy. The breakthrough: autopsy results. The results shocked everyone. Samuel's body contained massive amounts of arsenic. For the first time, Nannie's carefully constructed facade crumbled. When police confronted her, she initially denied everything, but soon, under questioning, she began to laugh. She admitted to poisoning Samuel, and once the confessions began, they didn't stop. Nannie giggled and joked as she revealed how she had poisoned multiple husbands, relatives, and even her own children over the years. Investigators were stunned. It wasn't just the number of victims that horrified them. It was the way Nannie spoke about the murders, often laughing as if she were sharing amusing stories. Her constant giggle earned her the nickname, the Giggling Granny. A trail of death confirmed. Police began exhuming bodies of Nannie's past husbands and family members. Each autopsy revealed traces of arsenic or poison. The list of confirmed victims included: two of her daughters died young under mysterious circumstances. Her mother, Lou Hazel. Her sister, Dovie. Her grandson, Robert. Her mother-in-law, Arlie Lanning's mother. Four of her husbands: Charlie Bragg suspected, Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton. Her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, confirmed by autopsy. In total, authorities believe she had killed at least 11 people, though the true number may have been higher. The psychology of a killer. As the investigation unfolded, psychologists and reporters debated what drove Nannie Doss to kill. Was it greed, since she collected insurance policies from many victims? Was it revenge against unfaithful or abusive men? Or was it simply the thrill of control? Nannie herself seemed to suggest it was about love. She claimed she poisoned her husbands when they disappointed her or when the romance faded. In her mind, if they didn't match her fantasies of perfect love, they weren't worth keeping alive. Her obsession with romance magazines and Lonely Hearts columns seemed to fuel her expectations, but reality always fell short. Poison became her way of rewriting the story. And through it all she laughed, the laughing widow. By late 1954, the walls had closed in on Nannie Doss. Her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, had been buried in Oklahoma, and the suspicious doctors who conducted his autopsy had uncovered the secret she'd carried for decades. Arsenic, plain, undeniable, and fatal, had ended his life. For the first time, science had caught up with her. But instead of breaking down in tears or begging for forgiveness, Nannie did something that left investigators, journalists, and the public in shock. She laughed. The interrogations. Police in Tulsa brought Nannie in for questioning. Sitting across from detectives, the plump, grandmotherly woman seemed harmless at first. She wore glasses, her hair pinned neatly, and she had the demeanor of a kind old lady. But as officers pressed her about Samuel's death, her behavior turned bizarre. She admitted to slipping poison into his food, describing it casually as if she were talking about adding sugar to coffee. When officers asked why she did it, she chuckled. "He was boring," she explained with a smile. Then the floodgates opened. Nannie began confessing to other murders, husbands, children, relatives, all while giggling and grinning. Detectives were disturbed by the light-hearted way she described death, often breaking into laughter at her own crimes. One detective later remarked, "I've never seen anything like it. She talked about murder the way most people talk about baking a pie." The media circus. Word spread quickly about the laughing widow who had poisoned her way through life. Newspapers gave her sensational nicknames: the Giggling Granny, the Jolly Black Widow, the Lonely Hearts Killer. Headlines were filled with disbelief. How could a kindly grandmother, always laughing and smiling, also be one of America's most prolific female killers? The contrast between her appearance and her deeds fascinated the public. Reporters who attended her hearings described how Nannie would sit in court smiling at the cameras, sometimes joking with officers or laughing to herself. Her behavior made her seem almost insane, but doctors would later determine she was mentally competent. The extent of her crimes. With her confessions and the exhumations of her former husbands, investigators pieced together the full scope of Nannie's killings. She admitted to killing 4 husbands with arsenic-laced whiskey, food, or coffee, poisoning her mother, Lou Hazel, after her father's death, murdering her sister Dovie, who was ill and living with her, killing her grandson Robert with poisoned prunes, killing her mother-in-law shortly after her husband Arlie Lanning's death, likely killing 2 of her daughters in the 1920s under the guise of food poisoning. In total, authorities believed Nannie murdered at least 11 people, though some suspected the number could be even higher. The trial of Nannie Doss. Nannie's trial focused on the murder of her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, because his death had been confirmed with forensic evidence. Prosecutors knew they didn't need to prove every other murder. Just one would be enough to secure a conviction and keep her behind bars. During the proceedings, Nannie sat calmly, often giggling at odd moments. She showed no remorse, no grief, no sense of guilt. When the charges were read, she smiled. When witnesses described Samuel's suffering, she chuckled. The courtroom was unsettled by her demeanor. The defense considered an insanity plea, pointing to her strange laughter and apparent detachment from reality. But doctors who examined her concluded she was sane and competent. Nannie knew right from wrong. She simply didn't care. Ultimately, she avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to murder. In May 1955, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Behind bars, Nannie was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where she would spend the rest of her life. Even in prison, she remained notorious. Fellow inmates were both fascinated and horrified by her constant giggles. She became a bizarre celebrity, often visited by journalists who wanted to hear her story firsthand. She never expressed regret for her crimes. Instead, she continued to claim that her husbands had failed her, that they didn't live up to her romantic ideals, and that poisoning them was her way of moving on. Her obsession with romance novels didn't fade either. Even in prison, she requested stacks of love magazines, poring over stories of perfect marriages and dashing men. For Nannie, fantasy had always been more important than reality. Public fascination with a killer. The American public was both horrified and enthralled by Nannie Doss. Female serial killers were rare, and one who killed her own children and grandchildren was almost unheard of. The fact that she did it while laughing made her case infamous. Psychologists debated her motives. Some believed she was a psychopath driven by greed, pointing to the insurance policies she collected. Others argued she was a sadist who enjoyed control. Still others saw her as a delusional woman whose obsession with romance and fairy tales left her bitter and disappointed, driving her to kill anyone who failed to meet her expectations. Whatever the reason, Nannie Doss had carved her place in criminal history as one of the most chilling female killers America had ever seen. A growing list of victims. Even after she was safely locked away, investigators continued to look into deaths surrounding Nannie. The pattern was undeniable: family members, in-laws, and husbands who had died suddenly while under her care. Though not every case could be proven, the list of likely victims grew longer over time. Still, Nannie seemed unfazed. To her, these were simply chapters in her story, told with a grin. The final years. Nannie spent nearly a decade in prison before her health began to decline. She developed leukemia and grew frail, though her cheerful attitude never seemed to fade. Even as illness consumed her, she remained the giggling granny. In 1965, after 10 years behind bars, Nannie Doss died in prison at the age of 59. She was buried without ceremony, her life ending much more quietly than the chaos she had created. But her story lived on, retold in crime magazines, documentaries, and later in books about America's most notorious killers. The image of the smiling grandmother who poisoned her way through life became a chilling reminder that evil can wear the most innocent of masks. Legacy of the Giggling Granny. When Nannie Doss died in 1965 inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, she left behind no grieving family, no mourning husband, and no one to carry her name forward with love or pride. What she left instead was a grim legacy, one of poisoned teacups, shattered families, and a laughter that echoed disturbingly through her confessions. The case of the Giggling Granny has since become one of the most infamous examples of female serial killing in American history, raising questions about gender, psychology, and the ways in which society views murderers. Even decades later, her story remains unsettling, not just because of what she did, but because of how she did it, with a smile. Female serial killers, an unusual profile. In criminology, female serial killers are comparatively rare. Most serial killers throughout history have been men, and their crimes are often characterized by overt violence, sadism, or sexual motives. Nannie Doss, however, broke this mold. Her methods were subtle. She preferred poison, a weapon historically associated with women because it allowed her to kill quietly, without confrontation, and often without suspicion. Poisoning is slow, giving killers control and deniability. Victims appear to suffer from natural illnesses until autopsies reveal otherwise. Her motives also diverged from the stereotypical serial killer profile. While greed played a role, insurance money and property often came her way. She claimed her true motive was romantic disappointment. When husbands failed to meet her impossible standards of love, she eliminated them. This made her particularly terrifying. She wasn't killing strangers, she was killing those closest to her: husbands, children, grandchildren, sisters, and mothers. The media's obsession. The press of the 1950s seized on every lurid detail of Nannie's story. Her appearance as a chubby, grandmotherly woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a warm smile clashed violently with her actions. Headlines screamed with nicknames: the Giggling Granny, the Jolly Black Widow, the Lonely Hearts Killer. Photographs of Nannie smiling in court or laughing with police officers only heightened the public's fascination. Some newspapers even printed her recipes and cheekily asked whether arsenic was her secret ingredient. For a conservative 1950s America, where the image of the wholesome housewife and doting grandmother dominated culture, Nannie's case was shocking. She was the antithesis of the ideal woman. Instead of nurturing her family, she destroyed it from within. The psychology of Nannie Doss. Psychologists who studied Nannie saw her as a fascinating, if chilling, case. Unlike many killers, she didn't fit the profile of someone consumed by rage or psychopathy in the traditional sense. Instead, she seemed almost delusional in her pursuit of romance. From a young age, she had been obsessed with romance magazines, love stories, and Lonely Hearts columns. These created unrealistic expectations about love and marriage. In her mind, every husband was supposed to be the gallant, devoted hero of her fantasies. When reality failed, when they drank, cheated, or simply bored her, she decided they were disposable. Her laughter was perhaps the most disturbing element of her personality. Experts debated whether it was a coping mechanism, a sign of mental instability, or simply her twisted sense of amusement. To many, it seemed she found genuine joy in describing her murders, almost as if the act of killing was a private joke only she understood. Society's changing view of domestic crime. The Nannie Doss case also had a broader cultural impact. For generations, society assumed women were natural caretakers, incapable of cold-blooded murder. Women were often seen as victims, not perpetrators, but Nannie shattered that illusion. Her case forced Americans to confront the reality that women, too, could be dangerous predators. It highlighted how domestic spaces, long assumed safe, could become places of hidden violence. A husband sipping coffee at the breakfast table, a child eating prunes for dessert, a mother moving in with her daughter, all could be unsuspecting victims under Nannie's roof. It also raised awareness of poison as a weapon. Forensic science began to improve in the mid-20th century, with doctors becoming more vigilant in detecting arsenic and other toxins in suspicious deaths. Samuel Doss's autopsy, which uncovered the truth, was part of this shift. Comparisons to other killers. Over time, Nannie Doss has been compared to other female poisoners in history. Belle Gunness, Norway, USA, early 1900s. A widow who lured men to her farm with marriage ads, then killed them for money. Mary Ann Cotton, England, 1800s, believed to have killed up to 21 people, mostly family members, using arsenic. Jane Toppin, USA, 1800s, a nurse who poisoned patients, later admitting she enjoyed watching them die. Yet Nannie stood out for her attitude. Where others tried to hide their crimes or expressed remorse, she laughed openly. Her cheerful demeanor became her trademark, setting her apart in the dark world of serial murder. The phrase, "don't take candy from strangers." While that phrase is more commonly tied to the Charlie Ross kidnapping case, Nannie's story carried a similar cultural warning. Be careful who you trust, even in your own family. Neighbors, relatives, and even doctors trusted Nannie. They saw her as a grandmother, not a killer. Her case showed how appearances could be deceiving and how the greatest dangers sometimes come from the people closest to us. Pop culture and true crime legacy. Since her death, Nannie Doss's story has been retold countless times in books, documentaries, and true crime shows. She remains a staple example in discussions about female serial killers and poisoners. Books and documentaries. Many true crime anthologies include chapters on Nannie, often using her as the classic example of a domestic poisoner. Television. Shows like Deadly Women have dramatized her story, emphasizing the contrast between her sweet appearance and deadly actions. Psychology texts. Criminologists often cite her case when analyzing the psychology of women who kill. Her giggling image, frozen in newspaper photographs, still unsettles viewers decades later. Final reflection. The story of Nannie Doss forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That evil can wear a smile, that killers can live unnoticed in plain sight, and that love twisted into obsession can become deadly. She was not the monster lurking in the shadows, but the grandmother offering cookies, the wife smiling at her husband, the neighbor laughing over the fence. That contradiction, the appearance of warmth hiding a heart of cold calculation, is what made her so terrifying. When she laughed during interrogations, it wasn't just at the detectives or the press. In a way, she was laughing at the world, for believing her, for trusting her, for never suspecting the cheerful granny next door. And that is why, even today, the legend of the Giggling Granny endures.